show the damn picture. That's good. Okay, we recognize this building? We recognize the strategy. And that would be, yes?
Little moves on the side.
Superposition. That's what you meant to say. This is clearly not one building. It's clearly a series of buildings that have been pushed together. There's a Latin cross, there's a big box, there's a long choir, there's a Lady Chapel sort of extension. And this would be obviously typical of A, Mannerism, and B, Palladio in particular. So this is a Palladian church. He did 3 churches in Venice. Was going about. And they all involve this idea of superposition. That's also to see the facades will also reflect this. The facades I will see a number of the buildings he's superimposing almost in the same plane. So you get this really interesting sort of perspective. Here's another one. In this case, we also have a little homage to a Renaissance church. Could be a little church at Todi or Montepulciano. Embedded in this other piece is a secondary transept. Is also part of a large box. It could be both. There's a long nave. There's a Latin cross. There's a Renaissance church. So this is just sort of underscoring. We've seen it with the houses, and the churches makes it incredibly clear that the churches are much more composite. There's no hint, there's no effort in the plan to make any kind of all-enclosing organization we find at, say, Villa Rotunda. But these really wonderful things are these amazing results. So on one hand, this screen wall is saying, for heaven's sakes, I'm just like the others on the outside, but obviously there's no wall there, and you look through. So it's very incredibly scenographic and very theatric in terms of these extensions of spaces into each other. So it's really kind of proto-Baroque that Bernini will look at this stuff and say, this is a great idea. So you're looking from the box into the Greek cross, or to be the Latin cross, through the screen to the choir, to the Lady Chapel extension. So the very dramatic interior choreographies that are being created by this juxtaposition. It's not just it's not like a shish kebab where there are a series of things on a stick there, all embedded in each other, with various degrees of erosion. To allow these sorts of really wonderful extensions of space. This would be a typical facade, where I'm looking at not one building, I'm looking at multiple buildings simultaneously. The door is its own little object. Clearly this is a guy, clearly this is a different guy completely, clearly that's a different guy completely, the box. So I'm seeing, and all of these respond to some degree to the organization of the plan inside. So within a very short distance, I'm seeing this embedding really as one surface. And again, what's interesting, well, it's just an interesting idea, but also it's really interesting because it's just kind of a proto-Baroque idea where there's sort of high layering inside the facade, column upon column upon column, sort of backing up, is really, you say, it has its origins with the previous century with Mannerism, and certainly with Palladio and that idea of superposition. And again, the interiors it starts to fragment into lots of ways, with clearly different organizations. Each organization, since it's embedded, is slightly incomplete, which then leads to its erosion and sort of the incredible complication of spatial organizations to create this sort of scenographic richness. It's also interesting, so if we look at Rococo, which will be about 500 or 200 years later, the plans will have some sort of a similar effect that they're really composites of different building organizations put inside each other. So even though it's way down the pike in terms of the idea of progression of history, it's very similar to what the devices are, some of the effects. Against another facade, I can just see the superposition of these two major pieces with each other. Couldn't care less. Even the door doesn't seem to responds to one but not the other. What's also particularly lovely about this is the building is basically brick, but the facade is marble. So the facade is sort of rendered very billboard-like, although it's three-dimensional. That the facade arguments are talking about the plan. The actual pieces are all sort of linked, the same material. Do that one. So going back to Mannerist painting for a bit, this is a painting by Vasari. He's a pretty smart guy. So one thing, if you're going to grad school, you should read Lives of the Artists by Vasari. It's sort of all the gossip on everyone who's active in the 16th century. This is a painting called Creation of the Cardinals, and I like it for a number of reasons. One is it's clearly Mannerist. Why? One, because of the incredible separation between the bottom and the top. Also, the bottom is very flat. The top has tons of volume. The bottom is vacuous. The top is dense. The top looks like a subway in New York going to Queens at rush hour. You just couldn't get more people in there. It's a bit ambiguous about who's doing what. And to add to the impact of that scrum, the columns actually enlarge. They're Solomonic columns. Those guys are sort of twist. Those are the originals are from the Temple of Solomon. These were brought back to Rome by the Romans. They could never figure out quite what to do with them. They sort of sat there for 1,000 years before Bernini employed them in St. Peter's. But they were well aware of them, so this is a century before they're being employed. Vasari is painting them. He's also transforming them. They are weirdly corporeal. Always reminds me of Jabba the Hutt, as they sort of move out to sort of be body-like. And also sort of the difference between, there are people like this on the train or the crowd in the subway that always really annoy you. They take up 4 seats with one bag and put their feet, this guy's, this incredible density, this guy's lounging across this, doesn't seem to be aware at all of the situation, because he really represents this division between the packed subway car and this vacuous stairway. There's also a little snake on the stairway, which might be indicating why people are going. And of course, another reason why this is Mannerist is there's the Bramante stairway, but typical to Mannerist, this is a really Bramante stairway where it wants to fit, but it can't possibly. Because the geometry changes, so as much as the first part of this wants to belong to that system, the rest of this just won't work. So these series of conundrums, and certainly all those themes, the idea of the splitting, the density, the volume, and the surface. So moving back to architecture, this is a building which competes with pretty much on the same level. This is a little villa in the Vatican Gardens. It's a casino of Pius IV. It's Piero Gregorio is a pretty good architect. And you approach it, this is the view you get of it essentially. It's pretty much exactly the same. And two things strike one immediately. One is the actual villa, which is the building back here, has a facade which has a lot of glop on it, not much sense of solidity, and not much sense of what's behind it. So in fact, it's a fairly poor description of the building behind it. And that's being paired with this little guy, the loggia, which is exactly the opposite. It is hyper-object. It sits there, I can see it in space. It's so hyper-object that it becomes, the facades are fairly incommensurate. So one, I get a segmented pediment, arch pediment. The other, I get a regular triangular pediment. Clearly the volume is saying these two things are making something whole. It's very unclear how those things collide. And we can see that inside there's actually a whole other building in there. There's the meatball, which really has nothing to do with the two facades. So on one side, the actual building is pretty much just a surface, even though the surface has volume to it. On the other side, the actual building is lots of buildings simultaneously superimposed or incommensurate, sort of just stuck there. So I just have way too much idea of three-dimensionality and not a clue about three-dimensionality other than the glop on the surface. Here's a closer look at that surface. This would again just be anathema to the Renaissance. It's really almost like wallpaper, but it's three-dimensional. Again, this is very similar to kind of a Gothic composition, which is certainly in terms of house facades or painting, really, where there's no particular interest in continuity, just separate scenes and panels. And it's only the base which sort of pops back into sort of normal architectural mode, where we're getting sort of normal ideas of a wall, some idea of trabeation, there are columns. And if we've seen this system before, where if the columns are engaged in the wall, they become pilasters and orthogonalized. If they're free from their wall, they become round and independent objects. Palazzo Massimo would be a good example of how that porch works, so we see it here. It's a common device. The Romans used it, Corb uses it. We're sort of seeing that here. So it's a sort of bog standard loggia down here with this billboard on top of it. Very different. And also the idea that the loggia is carved into something, whereas up above, carved into what? There's no hint of volume. Compared to the loggia on the opposite side, which is this almost like a sarcophagus. Super object, again, lots of cloth organizing it, but there's sort of a larger overall architectural theme organizing the cloth. And you look at the base of it, and you say, well, that's interesting, because it's exactly the same. So these two buildings which present completely different strategies. One just surface, no idea of volume. The other hyper volume, way too much, a lot in conflict. Have this one attribute where they're actually on the ground floor, certainly facing each other, across an oval, by the way. They're very similar. And in fact, it's even more interesting because the interiors are exactly the same. So I'm entering the world of the billboard, entering the world of the hyper-articulated sarcophagus, exactly the same space. Again, this would just be fingernails down the blackboard to the Renaissance. It would be much more, given all that difference that's being articulated in the elevations, there'd be much more idea of difference in terms of the facade, so really none at all. And you can see here's the actual plan of the villa, has not much to do with that facade. Here's another villa. This is Villa Giulia, so again, you would have seen most of these in history. I hope they have some resonance. They're worth knowing. It's like not knowing these is like not knowing 4 or 5 letters of the alphabet. It will just come back and bite you in the butt for the rest of your life. So you might as well know these. This is the Villa Giulia. This is just outside the walls of Rome. You could see it from the gardens of the Villa Medici, which we looked at earlier. And you look at the facade of this. Again, this is virtually everybody. Vasari was involved with this. Sort of everyone, every architect in Rome. This is like a after-dinner game, participating in how this would be designed. And the facade is pretty. It's not the most interesting facade in the world. It's kind of a tripartite, slightly Roman triumphal arch glued on top of itself. It's a pretty banal, but basically we're looking at a box. It's fairly Renaissance-y. The windows are sort of normal. Clearly it's a piano nobile. Just sort of a dumb box. Plaudio would have had been much more articulated. Behind it enlarges a bit, so we can see that, like vol au vacant, it's actually not so much a box, but a layered sandwich. Turns out that's not particularly true, although the sandwich motif is really good because, which we'll see, keep that in mind. And the interesting thing is, you get to the front door, which is exactly where we are now, and you're looking out the back door. This is very similar to the engineering building where you're invited to leave before you actually enter. Message worth taking to heart. So clearly, this is not a building which is designed to enter. It's designed to. It's really a gate. And it's surprising that the distance between the front door and the courtyard is so short when we know that from the elevations, That's a fairly deep building. In fact, and these two layers are being proposed. There's a view into the courtyard. It is sterile. There is nothing there. There's not much. There's some grass. There's a walkway. No statues. No fountains. And also, quite interestingly, the edges of it are made very imperfectly. We can see. We'll discover that in a minute. We see straight ahead. There's another wall to that. It's vaguely similar to the organization of the building itself inside that wall. We can see through that. There's a space beyond that. There's another wall. We can see through that to another space beyond that. So this is a little interesting, where this sort of thing just sitting there, this villa sitting there, is now actually becoming a gateway and service to the succession of spaces. So we know that by the time we've gotten here. And here's the plan. So you can see that, at least on the ground level, the idea of the two bars has almost no import. There's the front door, there's the back door. In fact, you cannot enter the building without going outside. You have to come around the sides. Here is the courtyard. Here is the wall we're looking through. There's another little loggia through to another little loggia to the garden. So we're looking really at sort of an explosion of a normal. I arrive, here's a villa, I go through the villa, there's the garden. One side is the city, then something like the city, some sort of rival thing, I go through it, and then there's the garden and the nature. Very much like Milton. South side is the city, go through it, and the north side, I have the forest with the wolves. The difference here is the space in between has been expanded to make much more of an argument. So I now have not just the villa and the garden. The garden, by the way, could not be less interesting. It's like they bought it on sale, into the summer sale at Lowe's and stuck it there. It is of no interest whatsoever. What is interesting is a placeholder, and also the villa is not that interesting. What's interesting really are these two spaces, this one and this one. This one, we can see, is made by a variety of things. This is being made by the villa. This is being made by walls. In fact, the walls are multiple, and I have this guy. Where's this guy coming from? Yes?
The move immediately to the left of it.
Yes. So imagine going to the cafe, buying a sandwich, and when you open the sandwich, there's an enormous bite out of it. You happen to see me chewing it. I'm chewing it. I'll be taking a big bite of something. I think you could make that case pretty quickly what's going on. But forget me chewing it. What if I have in my hand the bite? I've spit it out, and it's just there. So that's exactly what we're seeing here. So this is sort of the sock drawer par excellence, where the villa hardly exists. Such a bite has been taken out of that thing. How would you begin to program these rooms? Only a G3 could program these rooms, what would be called a kitchen, or whatever. Dog crematorium, just some name given to that shape. Almost none of it is left. Here, in fact, is really the most of the building. And in fact, this is really the payoff. It's a villa, which means I don't use it all the time. I would never go here in the wintertime. It's too cold. It can't really be heated. It's really sort of I wouldn't live here. I just sort of have parties there. And then some beauties in the summer. Rome in the summer is hot as hell. And in fact, this is a delightful place to be because it's cool. And it's cool because there's water, and there's water dropping. And there's also section. So this really becomes the garden. The garden is really architecture. The missing piece of architecture from here, I find here, this is 3 stories high. It drops down into the ground. There's layer upon layer of moving down into it, and water, running water, moving in and out. The heat capacitance of water is much higher than air. It can carry a lot of energy, which is why a very little bit of water can cool a lot of air. So this is it's like going into Kmart in San Antonio in the summertime when you walk down into that thing. There's a view of that wall again as we move out of the house, and here's the view back at the villa, which, interesting enough, is starting to fragment. So I can see there's just lots of weird stuff going on. So I can see there's this guy, which is kind of a bit of a temple, a little bit of a triangle arch. It's kind of the representative of the bar, an edge of the bar as it cuts through. This is always so weird. The closest thing I could think of is maybe Palladio's Loggia and Vicenza, where there are two different scales completely. It's almost as though we're looking at automatic shutters, almost like these screens are descending. That this wall is descending down to this, or it's rising up. Clearly, the two scales of these are just incommensurate. So we're getting some idea of something fairly composite and superimposed. What you expect to be something sort of a continuous bite through the sandwich, so in fact it's a very lumpy sandwich. And here is a bit of a view. We'll look at some more of the Nymphaeum. So you rise up a little bit, you enter, and you're looking down to this world. You descend down. Once you descend on again, get to this room. At that top level, there's another loggia here. We're looking through the garden, so you know it's there. But there's a surprise space. There's the views down to it. There's these little waterways going in and out in these grottos. There are little rooms inside. They're incredibly cool. You would have wine there and play canasta with friends or whatnot. Clearly, all the money has been spent on this thing. Just a delightful space. So it is really the garden. The garden really is the architecture. The architecture really is the piece of villa which is missing. So the rest of the villa, not so interesting. The bite I had of your sandwich, I got the meatball, turns out. So all the value is really in this one piece. It's incredibly complex and incredibly sectional. It's the last thing I would think about the garden, which is really sort of surface. And we go back, here's the section again, so there I rise up, we come down to this, come down to this. Here's the garden, there's the villa, this whole piece is missing. And you look at the walls, you can see, well, they're not particularly continuous. They hit very odd ways, that this thing seems to be sort of sliding along. It's coming from somewhere. In fact, where it's coming from is inside the villa. It's the dimension of the villa. And it sort of slides back and forth. So I'm always reminded of, this has to be one of the most awkward connections in architectural history. These two things just slamming together, just sliding right through. There's almost no correspondence. There's a huge door here. What the hell? There's another huge door right here. They're completely unaware of each other. Clearly these things, although odd enough, as a result of this configuration, you kind of want this guy to become the other A, B, sort of A. So it makes some sort of sense, especially having said that rhythm. A, B, G, L. So they're clearly sliding back and forth. So in that courtyard, we've seen this before in the Roman Forum, especially say Trajan, where the courtyard is being made by three different things. The curved part, which is not part of the side part, which is not part of the Basilica Olbia. They're sort of being gathered there to make that happen. We're seeing the same thing happen with this. So clearly, as the bite has been removed, stuff is being dragged out. Some material is being dragged out of the building with it, just sort of slipping along like elevator doors. This always reminds me of those expandable cups you could get as Boy Scouts, where they're about that thick. You kind of open them up, you know what I mean? They never work, they leak like sieves. So this also leaks like a sieve. Space just whooshes in and out of it. But it provides some idea of continuity. So a courtyard is being made by this thing, but it's being made by these things sort of sliding in and out. There's another view of that thing. Boy, this is awkward. Does this belong to this? Not particularly. Belong to this? Not particularly. So there, in this scheme, they're really, here's the view of the garden. It's so boring, it could be a Columbus Park, very municipal. I got a fountain, I got some shrubs. Bob's your uncle, you got a garden. And then we're looking back, we're looking into that grotto of the incredible Nymphaeum, and then through that to that courtyard. So the real payoff here, I have a pretty dumb villa, I have a pretty extremely dumb garden, but because of the expansion of those things, with the bite out of the villa, I now have extraordinarily weird courtyard, which is essentially vacuous space. I'm making space out of almost nothing. There's almost nothing in it. And then right next to that, I get hyper-dense space. Really the garden, because it's really the architecture. The remnant of architecture with all this section is the Nymphaeum. So very familiar Mannerist patterns, especially, well, certainly in architecture, but especially in painting, we can now see how the architects are competing with the painters to make these sort of spatial things happen. We've seen that little elliptical pool at Villolante. We've seen it as a little elliptical courtyard at the Casino of Pius IV in the Vatican. Here's another ellipse. This is in Rome. This is a church, St. Jacob of the Incurables. And what's interesting is that this is possibly the first example of an ellipse after Roman time being used for a religious building. And clearly it has certain advantages. So it establishes it's certainly a big space. It's very centralized, the way a Renaissance church would have been, at least traditionally. But it's also very axial, the way the church really wants it to be, and more like a traditional basilica. But the giant apse sort of represents the continuity of that, and the doors behind it. So it's both a center and a nave simultaneously, crossing and a nave simultaneously. Look at this. So I can see, not unlike Palladio and not unlike Villa Giulia, these things, the plan might say it's all one ellipse as a surface. The elevation doesn't. These things just won't connect. I get this very awkward arch trying to span between one wall system and another, and the dome just sort of, it drips down into these little areas on either side of the painting. God, this is awkward. So they were happy to live with that awkwardness because it helped describe the separation of this into multiple pieces. It helped to describe that these things were both enclosing the space but also moving back to allow this progression for that axis. And there's just tons of examples of this in painting. So this is again, you don't hardly need to know this, but you can see to the left, it's dense. To the right, it's void. To the left, there's a space back there. Can't really see what it is. To the right, there's that almost Tintoretto-esque what rush to the background, not unlike removal of the body of St. Mark, not unlike the creation of the cardinals, the Vasari painting we just looked at. There's this sort of languid figure moving across it to sort of interrupt that. And then we get to the really interesting stuff. So we're back to Palazzo del Te. The interior of this building is quite interesting. This is the Hall of the Giants. So clearly this has been influenced by Roman wall painting. And of any Roman example or any post-discovery of Roman painting by the Renaissance, there is nothing quite like this, where there is virtually no architecture left. It is all wall or ceiling, which then becomes paint. So this is called the Hall of the Giants. It's essentially depicting the fight between the gods and the Titans. The Olympian gods won, the Titans were expelled. And I'm seeing just the collapse of the old order. So the architecture, there is architecture there. The only evidence is this sort of a door cut into it. And then I can see the collapse of the architecture of the painting. I'm in a state, the whole room is in a state of collapse and conflict. There's fights going on. The difference between a ceiling and a wall, nothing. It's just all surface of the space being depicted in the painting. The only thing I'm particularly confident of is the floor. So we're not going to see it. We're not going to see that idea again, really, until Rococo, where the idea of all the walls and the ceilings sort of become like a cake pan to hide the cake. The only thing which is normal is the floor. And also in that building is this room, the Hall of the Horses, which is a bit similar, also slightly different. So one of the differences is that there is actually architecture in this room. The fireplace exists, it's not paint. The chairs exist, they're not painted. But most of it is paint. So the pilasters are paint, that's a flat wall. It's very realistic, it really works. But the killer are the horses. The horses are extraordinarily three-dimensional, and they're standing on ledges above the door. So the ledges, A, they don't exist. B, they're painted to look like they're not very big, but the horses are painted to look normal thickness. So it's extraordinary. Even Aunt Wanda is shocked coming to this room, where the corporeal presence of the horses in the room is so defied by the fact that they're just paint. There's actually there are pictures behind them. They're standing in front of them. Extraordinary space. So very hard for architecture to compete with this level of unreality. But it's given perspective. It's so easy to do in a two-dimensional surface. So this is a door to a cabinet that it's made out of, it's called maquetry. It's made out of wood. It's flat as a pancake. But in the door to the cabinet, we're seeing another cabinet where the doors are open, looking in. This is called the architect's tools. It's apropos of us. I'm sure you all have models of platonic solids on your desks. And books, that's even more funny. So we're looking into this incredibly rich three-dimensional world that opens up to us. It's actually it's on a bog standard cabinet. This is the door to it. So it's a complete illusion. And the fact that it's made up, there's no paint involved. It's all just pieces of wood with different colors of wood. It's natural, so just put in, it's flat as a surface, it's completely flat. Flat as a piece of typewriter paper. So the delight, is clearly this was meant to amuse. It's incredibly enticing. It's just, 500 years later, it's still enticing as a device. I think even the Mongans, when they visit Earth, we could find this really an enticing moment. And part of what's enticing is how incredibly good it is, and also how not real it is. If you were just looking in someone's refrigerator, open the door of the refrigerator, look in and see stuff, even a platonic solid, it wouldn't be that interesting. So if this were actually real, it would be boring. And we see some examples of architecture trying to incorporate this. This happens to be Dürer. So this is German. It's also, we didn't talk about that much, but it's interesting how much, so the Renaissance wasn't so interested in what was happening in Germany, which is tended to be certainly painting much more medieval. Mannerists often interested in what's happening in Germany, not so much contemporary, but the medieval stuff. So this happens to be late as Mannerist, but in fact, the idea of painting the facades of buildings to create illusions, or just painting them to ignore the space, is a common medieval practice. So what we were seeing in the Casino of Pius IV, with that very flat facade, you could say is very common medieval device. So this is I forget where it is. It's actually a project. Somebody has, you can see these blank things are actually windows. And the idea was, I have a house, it's sort of a piece of crap. I wouldn't mind it being a little fancier. I can't afford to actually build it, or I'm not that interested. But I wouldn't mind painting it. Something on it. So this is a proposal, I'm not sure if it was ever done, making this incredible illusion on the facade, not unlike the maquetry panel of this completely different building. The funny thing is we're very close, in a weird way, to undergraduate projects where there's this illusion of something being happening, but actually there's lots of space being indicated, there's lots of complexity, but in fact there's not much actual space, and there's really no interest in program. So it's very hard for architects to compete with something that dramatic, but it is possible. So certainly it has to become much more conceptual. So the problem with that is being conceptual is Aunt Wanda will not get it. She will go to Villa Rotunda and think it's pretty. She will not understand the spatial implications. But you would think architects could. The other route architects can take is something like this. So this is a little pavilion in Beaumarchais. It's built as a ruin. It actually is not a ruin. It was simply built to be crooked. You look at it and say, okay, it's a ruin, but the interesting thing is you walk inside, and then all of a sudden, all of your references are based on this. So all of a sudden, the entire world, which is inside the building, is telling you you're standing at this angle. It's quite dramatic. So I'm sure you'll get to Beaumarchais sometime during your life. Stand here, just stand here. Watch people come. Bob will go in. He'll go in sort of disinterestedly. You can see there's not much there. He will then come out with a smile on his face and then go grab Aunt Wanda and get her to go in there. So then the Aunt Wanda will come out and go get the kids and take them in there. So clearly they all get it. They all understand that this is a great device to transpose your understanding of the nature of the world and all allow your normal relationship to gravity to now become abnormal. So I think it's very effective. It's effective the way the McAfee panel is. It's unfortunately a bit of a one-liner and doesn't have much to do. I mean, you can't do this very much. If all architecture, every CVS were like this, it would not be very interesting. Okay. We're going to run back to these guys. What a fabulous thing this is. So now we go to another villa. This is the Villa Aldobrandini. Which we've seen before. We've seen before in terms of its elevation. So the weird syncopation of the implied structure. Actually, it's not structure. And the window system. They don't really work together. What's interesting for art purposes, well, multiple things. I mean, the villa is interesting because it's so flat. So it's essentially one room deep. This gives a certain advantage, certainly in terms of light. I get morning and afternoon light in every room. I get views of the garden and the views out of to the landscape for every room. This is in Frascati. Frascati is just south of Rome. It's about 50 miles south of Rome. It is one hell of a hill. It's such a big hill that it's actually a climate change. So on the at the top of Frascati, you can grow grapes. At the bottom, it's too hot in the summertime. So the Frascati has its own varietal of wine. And there were about 11 villas sort of stretched in a row next to the little town of Frascati along here. So this is Villa Aldobrandini is one of them. They didn't own lots of land, but they did own the vineyards. Also, it's a great place to go. You can have your own wine. It's really good wine, and it's cool in the summer as opposed to Rome, which is hot as hell. So there are lots of reasons why I would want it thin, for the view and the ventilation and the light. But what I really want it thin for is the view from Rome. That because it's so thin and so smushed, it becomes incredibly tall, and it's visible from Rome. So from Rome, at least before air pollution, you could see Rome. From Rome, you could look and see this thing. So clearly that's a huge plus for the Aldobrandinis, who have a leg up on all the other noble families. And the other thing about it is you can see it's also, it's very, very flat. The most three-dimensional piece is really this little guy at the top, which is virtually a separate building. It turns out that's the garden pavilion. The garden pavilion in this villa is in the villa. And it works because of the section, that the garden behind will start climbing the hill. So when we get to the top of the garden and look back at the villa, we won't see anything except this little piece. So if I want to look at a great view into the garden, I'll go to the garden pavilion. The other great thing about it is, because of these little bits of bit here and there, the entire thing, especially from a distance, starts to look like a Roman temple ruined. So it's sort of an illusion. It's kind of really sort of a happy circumstance. So it's sort of caught between a very historicist illusion and a very functional idea of that surface. Here gives you some idea of the flatness of it, and the arrival. The arrival, especially now, you come from Rome, you get to here, you've been looking at this damn thing for an hour, you come through the gates and it disappears. It disappears, you're walking through this tunnel, this stuff, and it's going to reappear really not until you get to the very end. You're not looking up at it. And there will be a series of doors. So it's a door here, a door here, a door here. In fact, none of those are the right door. They're all going to sort of lower levels. The actual doors are on the other side. So you come out of the tunnel there, series of layers coming up, but in fact you want to go around to the back. It's funny, again, we've seen this in Villa Medici. If you come in here, it's as though it's a palazzo. You're going to go up to the Piano Nobile, but if you come around to the back, it's a villa. You just come in at that level. And this is the garden. See that slot? That's the garden. That's it. So there's my drone. There's the axis we've come through. There's the villa rising up, and we can start to see this slot in the back is the garden. So this is kind of just a completely delicious. There's the Unite, there's the Uffizi, there's the Fit, one into the other. Each of those, they're clearly inverses of each other. And also the little guy in the front is clearly just a piece of the forest in the back pulled out to the front. So again, this is very similar to Knowlton, where the south garden is a piece of captured forest, and the north garden with the columns is a piece of captured city. It's like they're engaged in chess. And clearly, going back to what this building is about an edge. And it's about not just its own edge, but the edge of the forest. These two landscape changes, forest begins here, vineyards begin here, and then the villa sort of encapsulates that and then sort of controls these two pieces of each captured landscape. The plan of it. Here's the arrival sequence where you start just climbing. There's actually, you arrive down over here, you come up, you come in there, you come up, come in there. Actual entrance to the villa's in the back. Here's the view back. Air pollution, you're not going to see it, but there's Rome is in the distance. Here's the back elevation, which is slightly different. So the idea is a little more modulated. There's an idea of an object, that this is not quite so much of a standalone piece. All of a sudden the entire thing begins that. It is a bit stacked up, as opposed to something more coherent. It's sort of registering these various levels as you move through the garden. And here's the view into the garden. So there's a little exedra immediately behind the house with grottos in it. There's a statue of Atlas holding the world. The world is pouring water out. That water comes down, actually it's coming down a water stairway. That water begins actually at the top of the columns and jumping around. So it's just a reverie in water that Frascati, the hill of Frascati, there's enough water at the top of it to irrigate the grapes and certainly make this possible. And that is the slot. And the slot really is about, I don't even move along it, there's just the water. The water is cascading down here. That's also, there are handrails for the water. There's also water coming down the handrails. This is the garland. This is clearly being derived from Roman triumphal columns, like Trajan. We saw Trajan's forum. Where the wrapper here now is garlands of something, I forget what now. Really just to hold the water. So water's just whooshing down these things, it makes a nice noise, cooling the air. And then we sort of plunge back into the forest. The last thing we get to is very similar to Bellolante, where everything's organized along this one axis. We move back to a source. The source is increasingly primitive from the sort of over the top. There's the idea of this water stairway. So there's water in that, there's water in this going down, there's water in these things going down. View back. And the last thing we get to is back up in here. There's a little fountain where the water comes out of the ground. Very primitive, just a little grotto. There's Atlas. And here's the view back. We haven't gotten to the far part of the garden. You can see as we're moving back, the villa is disappearing. It's really the central axis. When we get to the last part, these will gradually disappear, and we'll just get that done. Halfway back, half of it's gone. And that's the source. So much more rustic. Clearly, this we're moving away from the city into nature. Clearly, it's fake, but what the hell. There is off to the side one of these features. So it's really not really part of that partie of the garden. It's just a fun thing to have. It's called a hellmouth. You'll find these occasionally in 16th century Italian gardens. And once you walk into them, they're big enough to get into. The eyes actually are letting light come into. So they're wonderfully cool. They're a place to sit down and rest, have a drink, talk to somebody, talk to Bob. They're also interesting because they will make funny noises. That just the noise of a conversation there sort of echoes around and comes out. It sort of transforms into sort of this muffled noise. So if someone is in there having a conversation and you happen to pass, it's a bit disconcerting having this mouth. And of course, if you start making funny noises, it becomes incredibly funny. So it's a great device to scare children. You think you won't do it, but I guarantee when you're there and there are children around, you will exactly do that. You will go inside and make funny noises. The children will scream. It's delightful. Another building. This happens actually not to be a villa. It's a palazzo. And it's a palazzo because it's in a town. But it's really going to act as a villa. So this is the Palazzo Farnese at Caprarola. There are tons of Palazzo Farneses. This is Caprarola. So Caprarola, it's not that far from Villolante. It's not far, it's Viterbo is the nearest town, or Bomarzo. They're all really quite close together. And this has an interesting history. So this is an area between Tuscany and Latium. Latium is Rome, that's controlled by the popes. Tuscany was controlled by the Medicis. This was sort of border area. They were often fighting. Caprarola is a hill town. It's actually a ridge town. It's running along a ridge. It's a pretty nice town, pretty big, not pretty big. It's a big, huge village, small town. But it's an important being part of that boundary. And the Medici thought this might not be a bad place to fortify, and the best place to put it was a very linear town because it's all along a ridge, would be to put a fort at the top of it. So they started to build one. As a fort, certainly by the Renaissance and certainly by the 16th century, there were certain geometries of fortification. Da Vinci is sort of playing with this, Michelangelo will play with this, and they will tend to be pentagonal, and it has to do with being able to, having surrounding corners, have the two corners adjacent to that be able to somehow cover you. So it turns out this pentagonal works out pretty well. So the foundations of this are pentagonal, and then the fall of Rome happens in 1520. Everything stops on this. They decide to continue, but now as a palazzo rather than a fort, but the foundation's already there. So they get Vignola, who's again a pretty good architect, to build this building for them. When do you notice that this is a pentagon? So these are not trick photos, and the answer is you never do. You can see there's something wonky with these corner pieces, but this looks kind of normal compared to that. So these are they're doing their own little geometry thing. And it's also interesting because not unlike Villa Malcontenta, as you move into this thing, you're encouraged to look at that corner. It kind of establishes that you expect this thing is going to be a rectangle or possibly a square. It certainly looks like a square. When you see right angles, so you look at the ceiling tiles in this room. How many are right angles? All of them. How many are you seeing as right angles? None of them. Does that cause the problem to the brain? No, it adjusts. So you're just used to adjusting constantly. The brain is saying this shape seems to be orthogonal, given the patterns I know. So it's interesting. As you approach, you can never see three sides at the same time. You can only see two. As you move in, you're actually moved to the outsides to look at that. So the town is behind us. It's really basically one long street. You enter here. There's the facade. You move to the left, back to the center. You move to this out again, back to the center. But that's actually the shape of it. And the interior has a courtyard, as you'd expect for a palazzo. It's a cortile. It is circular. It's one of the only circular courtyards. It's extremely beautiful. It's Vignola. He knows what he's doing. But also, why would that be particularly useful here? And the answer is because it's hiding the geometry, the larger geometry. It's easy to put you say a circle is an ideal thing. I was expecting a square. This is a circle. It's even better. And you then start to expect there to be some kind of a give, but some sort of pouche between the circle and the orthogonal geometry around it, as there is, even though it's not orthogonal geometry, it's pentagonal. And he's going to go to that circle a number of times. One is for the stairway up. It's, again, poche, it's wedged in the corner. Typically in a palazzo, you move to the left to find the stairway. It's true of the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. Also true here, you go through, and it's not just a bog standard stairway, it's an extremely beautiful, very wide cylinder, which is going to wrap you up to the level of the cortile. And on the opposite side, there's this guy, which is the chapel. And in fact, the chapel is a interior pattern to it, which is hexagonal. And it's two intersecting triangles. So clearly the triangle, given Christian theology, becomes sort of useful, something to do with Trinity. You can see that reflected in these axes that are being cut into that. But again, what's so useful is that a hexagonal chapel embedded in a square palazzo will cause problems. So you expect certain problems to start occurring between these adjacent rooms, and they do. But not because it's square, but because it's pentagonal. So it's interesting, they're really doing very opposite things. The circular stairway is hiding all geometries. The circular chapel is picking up hexagonal geometries to cause conflicts, but the conflicts are to expect it because you're anticipating this to be a rectangle or a square, and it is not. So you come into this, on both floors, there's a series of enfiladas, we go up one more. These are the completely symmetrical left and right, except for these guys. So you would come into this thing, you'd move along here, you move to the back, you come along here, and you look out of there, and there's the garden. So we've seen it again before. This is the stairway. Extraordinarily beautiful. And you also see this is all Roman 4th style wall painting. Just incredibly illusionistic. There's that court. So your experience of it, you come through the court, the town is to the bottom, you come in, you find the stairway, you find the circular thing, you find the hexagonal chapel, you move back along the row, you find another row to the back in the garden. So you put it in your mind together. This is clearly the plan of the building. There's nothing you've seen which would indicate that's not true. It just turns out not to be. So there's this whole other world. There's not one garden, there are two. There are in fact two facades. So this has two tremendous advantages programmatically, and also then a really interesting idea conceptually. So clearly the conceptual idea is I'm making unreal space. You think this is one building, is actually another. Unlike Manners painting, where you're seeing something quite surprising, what's surprising was that it actually is, not what you think it is. What you think it is something quite normal. So that's the sort of the intellectual delight. The programmatic delight are two. One is that when Aunt Wanda and the kids visit, they can never, as long as you're in the 5th side, they'll never find it. You can tell the butler to say, oh yeah, you're indisposed. You can be having a party out in your garden. You're walking around in your jams, having a rum Ricky, petting the dog, playing with the rabbits. In your study, they have no idea there. So you have this complete run of your own. It's like Etch-a-Sketch. You can just sort of pull up and always have a completely intact garden and a series of private rooms with your study. This happens to be the study. So the study is the only place in the entire scheme you can actually see both pieces simultaneously. So the patron, the owner, gets that privilege. And the other programmatic benefit of this is summer-winter. So in the summer and the winter, you just reverse it. So in the summer, there's no way in hell you want to be occupying south-facing rooms in central Italy. You want north. In the winter, you want just the opposite. So it's essentially a solar device. It's a solar heating and cooling device. In the summer, Aunt Wanda, you just make Aunt Wanda go to the left, and she gets the hot rooms in the hot garden, you get the cold. I just can't resist that. And wide enough and gentle enough you could ride a horse up and down, which, of course, you would. There's the overall view of it with my drone. Here's Garden 1 with Aunt Wanda and the kids. Here's Garden 2, me and my jams, my rum Ricky. You have no idea. Now he's dead. There's another surprise here, which is incidental to this, which is added a bit later, and that's the casino. So Walding and Garden Pavilion, they said, okay, we'll stick one. And so they put it, here's the view this is actually the town, that's the street. You can see how high up we are. We are way the hell up. Rome is down there somewhere, an hour or so away. Again, that sort of view around that corner. Here's the central circular courtyard. It's very pretty. And what the hell more Roman wall painting. And then this is the view of the casino. So further up the hill is the casino. What does casino actually mean? What does Eno mean? Yes?
A small building and a landscape.
Yes, actually, it's a small house. So Eno is yeah. So what does domino mean? Eno is small. What's dom? Domus.
House.
Who had Spanish in high school? Yes, it's house. So domino, odd enough, is a small house. Casino is a small casa, also a house. So it's a little small house. So it's a little small house in the garden. So you go up and buildings. You might play cards there. So you might bet on the cards. So that's sort of the origin of that. So off the two gardens off there is they will join. There's a place they will join. Off of that, a route will begin, and up the hill it will go through the woods, kind of wandering. So it's a grassy swath with trees on both sides. As I go along, I'm going to reach this point down here, where the grassy swath starts to level off, but the trees don't. They keep rising, and I start picking up retaining walls. So that I will then arrive at this courtyard with retaining walls all the way around. I'm now underground conceptually in this sort of void. At the upper end of that void is this solid. So it's very similar to the Aldobrandini, where I get figural void, this meadow, artificial meadow in the forest, and this object at the top. Sort of the two versions of garden. And what's really nice is really the thing that connects them. So again, it's one of the most amazing water stairways. It's a slot you're going through. You're actually rising up, but actually the woods are rising up with you, so you don't really gain anything. You reach another underground courtyard here with a fabulous fountain and stairways up, and then you arrive at this terrace of the casino. So this is the first space you get to, with retaining walls, moving up somewhat in a state of disrepair. There's the water stairway, water coming down, you rise up through that. The next courtyard, also still below, is really crescendo of water and also crescendo of architectural value. These are very rich things. There's this giant cup with the gods dipping their hands into. This beautiful little reveal here. This actually does not, it's actually a freestanding thing. It's this lovely little lip. The water, there's a slight opening all the way around it. And this is the view at the top, looking down that slot back towards, you don't see the palazzo, it's off to your right. You're looking at really this, the juncture, just this slot. And you arrive then at these gardens within the casino behind. Is this. There's a bit of a program here. I think we won't go into that. There's a little building at the top. Also has an interior decorative scheme. Really pretty. So we've already seen this guy once. Let's go back there. This is Beaumarchais. So of all the Mannerist gardens, this has to be the most standalone, weirdest. So it's a bit disjointed. It's actually a 9 square with a whole lot of movement going on. It's in a very eccentric valley. There are a lot of big chunks of rock that were just left in place and carved. So the great thing is you don't have to move much there. And it becomes a series of these little episodes, and these episodes will be really fairly bizarre and usually a bit disturbing. So it's a bit of a cartoony thing. So this is a sea monster. It's also incredibly I guess pornographic would be the best word. So it's a sea monster. The legs turn into these sort of mermaid-like pieces. Virtually everything there is some sort of a monster. It's called the Garden of the Monsters. It's a dragon fighting a dog. Another sea monster, flying sea monster. So this would have been carved out of a solid rock that was on the ground. Another monster with something on his head. Another monster. An elephant carrying a castle with I think this might be a Carthaginian, and a Roman soldier in the elephant's trunk being killed. It's fabulous fun if you're a 12-year-old boy. I mean, everything is just completely enthralling. There's the Roman soldier being killed. Monsters be happening. Hellmouth. That has to be the best Hellmouth ever. A basic idea of the organization, so it's more like miniature golf as the ones we've seen. It's very episodic you move through. This is the entrance to it. Sort of wind through this valley. There's no particular route you take. And architecturally, this is probably the clearest piece. It's this, again, there are a lot of people involved here. This is Vasari. And the interesting about this for us is, so in a normal Pantheon, the Pantheon in Rome, certainly in Roman times, you would have never seen the dome. It would always have been a surprise. So it's interesting, as it starts to become a garden pavilion, and 200 years from now, from this building, it'll become a common device, say, in English landscape, which we'll see later. This really represents this first separation from the fabric it was sitting in, and being seen as an object by itself. And it's interesting for us for several reasons. One is, I mean, even the Pantheon is so big that the porch to hide the dome is enormous. It's an enormous scale. It has to be the biggest temple front ever. And here, that sort of disjointedness is compounded by the fact that it is so big. It's a triangular building. The porch is massive, not so much in terms of elevation, but just for duration, and clearly stuck on. And also clearly does not work with the back part of it. So, yeah. Just the clearly sort of homage to Palladio, we're seeing this sort of two buildings about to merge, about to be, they're in the process of being stuck either onto each other or into each other. That each one is highly centralized. As a result of this particular bay scheme, there actually is an interior paradise garden here of 4 columns, a little baldacchino essentially, to which this is competitive. So some of you noticed in the homework for La Tourette the degree of to the degree it's possible to see the cortile as some sort of a cross-axis. There's some idea, and clearly the oratory really wants to be that cross-axis. There's a bit of a competition. The same thing is happening here between the incredible centrality of that and the incredible ability of this to hold a center, describe a center. You sort of think of an Egyptian temple cult room with this has the role of the room as ideal. This has the role of the statue being another sort of an ideal superimposed in it. So here they're adjacent, very similar, but sort of being pulled apart or being pushed together. And just this weird collision and scale competition between the two is quite bizarre. Nothing compared to the bizarre. This will not appeal to a 12-year-old boy as opposed to the others, but I think intellectually it's probably the most interesting piece. There are other gardens, which I think you probably have never heard of or seen. So this will be one, again, very appealing to a 12-year-old boy. This is just north of Venice, also Mannerist. This is, again, sort of a one-off. So unfortunately, the garden itself is now pretty much gone. This one piece stays. So this is it's a statue. It is also carved in place and plastered. It is ginormous. So you can get inside him, you can look through the eyes. So something like the Statue of Liberty is not like a complete invention of the 19th century. It's called the Spirit of the Apennines. Here is the guy. There's a little lake here. Here's the building. You come through a cave. Inside the cave, there is a perfect little temple. You would then wind up through a series of chambers. A bit of weird stuff happening here. It's actually a fireplace. And get up in here and occupy the head and look out. There's an underground chamber. I'm not sure exactly what this is. I think it was getting down to a boathouse originally. Down the lake. There's the statue. Kind of fabulous. A model of the statue. And the interior spaces. This is the guy who's been here, and this is actually the garden. So there's the villa. And what's really spectacular about the garden, is there's no particularly clear center to it. There isn't access. It's not particularly interesting. It's not organizing stuff. It's really organizing of these two valleys, these series of valleys, Valley A and Valley B, which also constitute a series of pools. So we won't go into this really much now, but if you're interested in odd shapes as a series, you couldn't go to any better source than this. So they're all slightly blobbed, sometimes making gestures to each other, sometimes not. This very interesting sequence of things. What they were used for, how you experience them, don't exactly know. So unfortunately, they're all that is gone. It's just sort of a field now. To give you some idea of this really, the space around them, sometimes they become natural, sometimes incredibly artificial, sometimes enclosing bits of architecture. They must have just been wonderful things. Where are we? Okay. This is Villa d'Este in Tivoli. So Tivoli is a lot like Aldebrand Frascati. It's a hill south of Rome. It's a much bigger hill. It's a lot farther south. I think the Roman name for this is Tibernia. It would have been, it still is. It's a great place to spend the summer because it's so much cooler than Rome. Hadrian's Villa is at the base of this hill. So it indicates that the Romans were here. It was a huge summer. If you had any money, you would go to Tibernia. So that becomes then Tivoli. Again, if you have any money, you would live there. And here there are really two interesting things about Tivoli for us. One is this villa, and the other is something else we'll see in a minute. So this is the villa. The building itself is not so interesting. It's kind of big. What's interesting really are the gardens. And what's interesting about the gardens is there's sort of a nay, but way too early. So it's clearly based on some idea of Paradise Gardens. Here's one. But the module keeps repeating, and it makes it very hard to see that pattern. So, for example, in the La Tourette patterns, La Tourette plans, all sorts of things were visible. All kinds of L's be happening. And in fact, I think a lot of the stuff that was happening is not happening. So, for example, you look at look at the ceiling, look at the lights. How many swastikas in this room? Thousands. So just tell your parents you're having a class in a room which will be decked with thousands of swastikas. But they're not visible, right? They're not visible because the grid is just erasing them, and it will not allow. I cannot see the figure because of the insistent equality between all the grid for all the pieces. No particular center. All the edges just screaming are the same. They also spell out Professor Graf as a genius. Lots of stuff is sort of in there. Can't see it, unfortunately. And the same thing is really sort of happening here at Villa d'Este. Because of the grid, there are these little notions of centrality, but they disappear very quickly. Because the pieces are so similar, it really turns into a grid, and you kind of get lost. You sort of you're wandering through. It's like being in Houston. You kind of wander through. You find a moment where something is happening, but it's sort of hard to figure out how that works with everything else, or work back. There's one exception, or possibly two exceptions. The biggest exception is this axis, which turns out to be the main axis. Not that you would know it, except when you're on it, that's when you can see the villa. It's really the only time you can really see the villa very well. And when you see the villa, you also see a series of doors, a little like Aldobrandini, stacking up. I think there are 5. Each door corresponds to a level of the garden. So it's sort of this heightened sense of centrality, very sort of proto-Baroque. The other axes, there will be doors, there won't be a particularly big thing. The other big feature is this guy. So this guy is it's a water feature, it's a canal, which also acts as an enormous void that is kind of a real breath of fresh air. The rest of this, this is quite grown in, so all these parterres are heavily wooded. This is the one exception. This is really the one big space, and it cuts all the way across from the town side to the open side. There's a hell of a cliff on the open side. It's just going to plunge down. So there's really, you could make the argument that there's that cross axis and this major axis, but in fact the actual organization wants to erase that. And I will then move around this and find things. Sometimes they're incorporating bits of the grid as their own. All of a sudden this becomes a 4 square, for example, or that. And other times things are just placed. This is one of the things which just be placed. And it's very reminiscent of the Villa Medici in Rome, where we know in the Villa Medici in Rome, if I get to the snail mound, because of that position, Rome is erased, and I can only see the tall things, the towers and the domes. This, so the entire, my view of Rome becomes one really of a cartoon, sort of a tourist map. The same thing is happening here, where this is a depiction of Rome, but really only by a few monuments. This is one of the central monuments. What would this be? Yes?
Ship.
It is a ship, but what would it be in Rome? Is it famous for its ship? Anybody been to Rome? You need to go back and look a little closer. So it turns out there's an island in the Tiber. So one of the reasons why Rome is where it is, probably, is because of the island. That's just so true phenomenologically. So why is Munich where it is? Island in the river. Paris, island. Vienna, island. Berlin, island. And why the island? Why do I care? It splits the river into smaller components. It makes it easier to cross. So cities on rivers with islands, often that's really why they're there, the islands. That's true of all of those examples. So there's an island in the Tiber. I can bridge to the island, a fairly small bridge, another bridge on this side. I can get across. That was the main crossing early in Roman times. And it didn't take the Romans very long, especially when the city started to expand, when the Forum became not outside the boundaries of the village, but in the middle of the city. They realized really two things. One, that the island was a spectacular object in the city. You could just see it. And two, when the spring floods came, it was always flooding. Said, how can we solve that? And they really did. The one solution solved two things. They just turned it into a boat. So the upriver side, they put a prow on, which could defend the island from the river. It would just push the water to either side. And they did this thing to the opposite side, what the hell? And they then conceptualized the entire island as it was a floating boat. It became a very special place to be in Rome. So this is that. This is the island, the Tiburtina. And this represents the Tiber. So we're now standing, you would stand on the outside, looking towards the other side. Here's Romulus and Remus. This represents the Palatine Hill, where Rome was being established. This represents the capital. Anyway, so it's a little model of Rome, sort of as these little pieces. So it's fairly unusual. This is the only place this really happens, but it's interesting having just looked at Beaumont. So clearly it's kind of that A, kind of episodic series of events, and B, having looked at the Villa Medici in Rome, it's also the idea of looking at Rome on a reduced scale as a kind of cartoon graphic of itself. This gives us, these have to be other mountains. Here you get some idea of the level of the hill it's on. There's the little boat. This is looking back the other way, at the other end of the big waterway. This is the organ fountain. So there's actually a pipe organ powered by water. The sound is phenomenal. It was restored about 10 years ago after 300 years of not working. So it took them 300 years to figure out how it worked. So they think they've got it, so it's now next time you go there, it's going there. So that's kind of interesting how the, it's one of the few gardens where that's the idea of that noise, that particular noise is sort of incorporated. And again, there's so much water coming through this thing to power it that there's about a 20-degree drop in temperature. So on a hot day, this is a great place to go. It's just fabulously air conditioned. And then lots of other little pieces. So this is clearly very similar to Bramante stairway. So I'm missing a chunk of the grotto and then the other chunk out of there. Here's that slot of space moving through. Whereas the grid comes across and it's now kind of exposed. You get this great view, one to the organ fountain and two, the valley outside. Looking back, there's just a series of plunging. It's very Las Vegas. So I think Bellagio has the big fountains. Except that Bellagio doesn't have any fountains in Italy. It's really Villa d'Este. Unbelievable scale. And then here are the bits of the parterre, which should either be forested or little secret gardens like Villa Medici. You go in, various different things happen. This is the view from the villa looking at it. This is the top terrace. There are a series of doors. Actually, another door behind us, another door just below us. You actually don't get much of a view of the garden. What you do get is a great view down that one axis. It doesn't really show you very much. So it's interesting that the gardens in the villa are almost becoming disconnected. There are these moments where there's connection. It's certainly true of the casino at Caparola and the Palazzo. Also true of Villa Giulia, where the gardens are, in that case, are not really important, but they're getting farther and farther out. So we're sort of seeing the idea of the garden and the villa becoming disconnected to two separate things. Incredible section running through here. Okay. I think that's it for mannerism. So we'll start this today and continue it. So this is a building which you should know. Do you guys know this building? And it's
Miller House.
It's the Miller House. So there's really two reasons you should know it. Or really three. One, A, it's incredibly good. Two, it's incredibly close. And three, it's done by a OSU professor. So this is the Miller House. It's in Lexington, Kentucky, which is not noted for its architecture. This is about, you wonder how many houses are designed by architects? How many people live in metropolitan Columbus? 2 million. How many houses are designed by architects every year? Any? Are any? Are any good? Well, that's interesting. Just parenthetically, that's sort of interesting. So, how big was LA in, say, 1900? I think it was about 300,000. What was happening in LA architecturally in 1900? Lots of stuff. For one thing, two Ohio architects, two brothers. From, I believe, Chillicothe, had moved out there, I think for their health. Who were they? Green and Green. So it's worth knowing who Green and Green are. We might look at some of their stuff. So they were doing one of their houses for another displaced Ohio family, the Gambles. You figure out where they're from. Also had some money. Moved out to LA, Pasadena really, for retirement. Lovely climate at that time. And had these Ohio brothers, it might have been the connection, built a house for them. So it's just extraordinary. And they're cranking out just these extraordinary buildings. And there's lots of other activity. You wonder what's happening in San Francisco. San Francisco will be a little larger than LA in 1900. It will not be 2 million. It'll be substantially smaller. And there are probably 5 really, really good architects. Maybach is probably the best. Polk is no slouch. Maybach is genius. Cranking out stuff, primarily houses. So, and clearly, we saw Giulio Romano did his house for himself. So the idea of a middle-class house for someone certainly is possible in the Mannerists. It's going to explode in the 19th century, where people of fairly modest, either they might be very wealthy, but certainly people of modest means, start having houses designed which are pretty, they might not be very big, but they're of substantial interest architecturally. So the Miller House really belongs to that tradition. It's interesting because that tradition, A, it has almost completely died in this country, and B, that was really the traditional route of establishing your reputation as an architect. It's usually somebody in your family, hopefully your parents, would have you build a house for them. So you think of Gwathmey, it's Gwathmey House. His parents built a beach house in Long Island. You think of someone like Graves, it was his high school buddies who built a house in Fort Wayne for them. Richard Meyer, it was his parents. Venturi, it was his mother. How many of you think you're going to build a house for your parents? It's not going to happen. And where would you build it? Where do you buy a lot? Well, we don't build houses that way anymore. We build houses by the bajillion in a development where you cannot buy a lot because it's full of the MI or whatever stuff. So it's not going to happen. So, and the odd thing is, this has actually turned into that. So this was originally, I think, on 20 acres. It's now been sold. It's been turned into a development. It's interesting because it's a fairly high-end houses, $400,000, $500,000. It's not that old. I think maybe 5 or 6 years, something like that. Already falling apart because they're made out of poop. They're just crappy houses made out of poop. They're just going to rot away. So amazing. This is a country which just does not believe in having a future. Healthcare, transportation, education, none of it. Anyway, but there's a client for this, amazingly enough, and they find Jose at this point is chair or dean of the School of Architecture, which I think how the connection is made. So it turns out if you want to design a house, you better become a dean somewhere. So this is the house he designed. So you look at this, and you can say immediately, this is composite. Sort of like Palladio. This is being made out of a series of pieces being put together. So there's clearly a kind of core thing, kind of hard to see what it is, and clearly there's an outside thing, a screen thing, which is clearly, really is a screen. So it acts as a brise-soleil. This is, I say this is Kentucky, but in fact it could be Columbus. And if you spent a summer in Columbus, you know it's virtually uninhabitable. It's very hot and really humid. You very rarely find that kind of humidity in Europe. So in London, for example, there was a heat wave this summer. It got up to 85. People were just falling over dead. It had like a 20% humidity. It just felt fabulous. It's just bizarre. The people accustomed to a very thin window of, if it goes below 35, they fall over dead. If there's a piece of snow on the subway tracks in London, the entire system will come down. So, but certainly in Lexington, you need some kind of relief from the south. But the thing is, sitting in the landscapes, you wouldn't mind sort of a view to the south, especially in the winter you wouldn't mind a view, so wouldn't mind the heat. So the brise-soleil is sort of solving that. So clearly that's coming from Corb, and from Corb is coming from where? Villa Savoye, lots of brise-soleil. Garches, lots of brise-soleil. No, so it's to be post-war, where he's sort of incorporating vernacular. So before the war, much more modern. After the war, much more vernacular. We've seen little hints of that before. We saw it with the stone wall at Swiss Pavilion. It's that very out-of-place little thing. So this is clearly sort of homage to Corb. There's a grid. This is actually is a grid, but we can see immediately there's some exceptions to it. So A, it seems incredibly porous. B, very strong rhythm to it. Where are the funny bits? I think there might be 4. One, 2, find the noses. 3, missing a piece, which makes this happen. And 4, equal, too much. I think that's it. And there's an anomaly. So I look at this thing, I say it's a screen wall, I get it. And it's fairly neutral. It's certainly neutral compared to the thing behind it. But it's not so neutral. And so it immediately asks certain questions, make propositions. First of all, it asks, let's go back to thing one. Thing one is saying, something on this end is different, and this doesn't quite fit. That this wall is its own thing. It's not just part of this. Whereas to the right, we say, no, this wall is one of the boys. There's the 4 boys. There they are. This is saying something different. This is saying that's not the wall, but there's this idea of this entablature. It be extending. It wants more. And in fact, if it wants more, I start to get this little void, which starts to become the 5th bay, the beginnings of the 5th bay. So this thing ends very abruptly this way, but I have too much there. Here I have too much that way, and those too muches are telling me something. Here is too little material, but too much space. This is telling me this is the middle. It's a giant middle. It's making a gate. That's also different. It's interesting because when this becomes the middle, then all of a sudden the first bay becomes the exception between the funny wall and this thing. All of a sudden this bay says, I'm not exactly like you. I'm really a buffer. And of course, then the anomaly here, this is too much, allows the entire thing very slightly to be lifted, like we saw with the facade of the Palazzo Massimo. The grid above the attic windows can just lift all of this. So just as we arrive, we start to see this facade. We already know a lot about the building. We know it's saying there's this thing behind, but this thing is raising some questions. It's raising some questions about why this, why that. It's also saying, this is one hell of a special figure. This is kind of isolated, and there's kind of a piano nobile thing going on here too, where this thing gets lifted off the ground. Okay, we'll continue with this as a quiz on Wednesday. No class next Friday.